So what we'll do is we're going to go over a few different things today about public speaking. We'll talk about basically the three components that comprise effective public speaking. But before we do that, just a quick informal poll. You can just answer in the chat. Just want to know if y'all are ever uncomfortable or nervous or anxious when it comes to public speaking. Never. Nice. Tanya hates it. Nice. Just laugh out loud. Always. Yeah. Cool. Pretty standard. So the reason why I asked that question is because of just how normal it is, right? So I started off this webinar by admitting that I was nervous. I have, at this point in my life, probably delivered 1,000 public presentations, and I have been teaching it for about 5 years now. And the nerves just never go away. And the reason why I bring that up is because even though what I'll be teaching today is not like a sequence or a recipe for how to put together presentations, it's not going to work in sequential order. So there's not necessarily a first step. But if I were to say that there was a first step, it would be to acknowledge that being nervous and being anxious is just part of the process. And I'd like to kind of share with you the story that I really learned that. So when I was trying to figure out where to do my PhD, I had reached out to a professor at the University of East London, and we were in a Zoom meeting, essentially. This was before Zoom, so I think it was Skype, but we were in this meeting and I told him that I teach public speaking. And so this professor has done a lot of like really cool, big things. He was an executive coach for Google. He has done well-being training for the royal family, a lot of really big time stuff. And the reason why I bring that up is because he was telling me the story about one of the recent times that he had to go deliver a presentation. And he was talking about how when he was on his way over there driving to the place, he couldn't stop thinking about how nervous he was and how badly he wanted to figure out a way to crash his car in a way that would not hurt anybody so that he could get out of delivering the presentation. And this is a person who at this point has delivered thousands and thousands of presentations to large groups and very important people. And even though he's done all that, he still gets very nervous before a presentation. And when he told me that, that was maybe my second year teaching public speaking, and it's something I never forgot. And it's something that really helps me when I'm really nervous before a presentation, because it's just part of how it works. So if there is a first step in public speaking, it's just acknowledging that your nervousness is normal and to just kind of ignore it. So with that being said, I would like to give y'all my background. So again, my name is Matt. You can call me Matt or Matthew. My education, I received my bachelor's degree in interpersonal communication, specifically communication between leaders, specifically nonverbal communication of leaders. So I looked at how your nonverbal communication makes an impact on your efficacy as a leader. In my master's degree, I studied the relationship between culture and resilience. My degree is intercultural communication. So I was looking at how specifically cultural communication is a tool of resilience. My working experience, I started teaching public speaking in 2016. I've taught, I think, 16 courses in public speaking throughout those various semesters at this point. But I've also done what I do for CGU, which is public speaking webinars. I did that for the University of New Mexico. I did that for the University of Melbourne. And I also do that for Rice University, where I also teach strategic business communication. So communication is my thing. I get all fired up about it. I love studying it. I love teaching it. And I have a very diverse background when it comes to my communication education. Now, my other career before I got into teaching is I was a basketball coach. I coached at every level. I coached teams, and I also worked as a one-on-one skill coach for professional players. And the reason why I bring that up is because that highly informs the way that I teach public speaking. So when you're teaching skills to basketball players, you want to start at the basics and then you build on them from there. And that's essentially how we'll approach this public speaking webinar today. We'll start with the basics and show you how you can start to build on that. But one of the difficult things about preparing this is I have to keep my time limited because there's so many things to talk about. So keep this in mind, is that it's more of a surface level kind of discussion about public speaking. We won't go too deep into a lot of these topics. But with that being said, don't feel like this has to be a lecture where you're just sitting there listening to me speaking. If you have questions, or if you have stories, anecdotes that you want to share with us, if you have your own tips and wisdom, things that you've learned, absolutely please share those. And if you do have a question you want to contribute, you can just unmute yourself. You can put it in the chat. You can use the raise hand function. I'll be paying attention to all of those. So whatever's most comfortable for you, we'll make it work. Okay, so I'm going to share screens in a second, but what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to upload a few files. First, I'll upload our slide deck that I'll be using today. And then I'll also upload a couple of handouts that you can use for yourself. So the first one I uploaded is practicing presentations. So that'll be some tips on how to practice, and we'll go over that as well. The second one I just uploaded is the one-page PDF version of basically what we'll go over today. And then I also am uploading the slides that we're going to be using. And those are uploading now. So now I'm going to share screens. Can y'all see the screen? Yeah, cool. All right. Oh, ignore that where it says big pitch right here. This was from last year, last semester. Sorry about that. So what we'll do, I gave you my introduction, I told you my background, so we're past that. So we'll talk about the 3 characteristics of effective public speaking, and then we'll talk about practicing and preparing for your presentations. So those 3 characteristics of effective public speaking is that it is organized, it's knowledgeable, and it's engaging. And you can think of that as you, the speaker, but you can also think of it as the presentation itself. So the presentation is organized, it's knowledgeable, it's got all the content it needs, and it's also engaging, but the same is true for you as a speaker. That's my stuff. So again, here are the characteristics of effectiveness: organized, knowledgeable, and engaging. And you're going to notice that I'll probably be repeating these things a lot because repetition is very helpful for learning. And it's something that I want you to think about when you're building your own presentations. You really want to be repetitive about what your key point is, because that boosts the retention of that information. So again, the characteristics of effective presentations is that they're organized, knowledgeable, and engaging. But that's also true for just communication in general, whether it's spoken or written. You want it to be organized, knowledgeable, and engaging. So organized, one of the hard parts about presenting is just kind of where to start. It seems like there's 2 scenarios, right? Where we're told we're delivering a presentation, and it could be something that we don't know anything about. So it's hard to understand, what is the topic, because we don't have enough information for that topic. But it can also be the other end too, where you know so much about that topic that you don't know where to start because you don't know exactly what you're talking about, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples from my own experience to show you kind of how this works. So actually, let's go back. The way you want to organize is you want to start by asking yourself and answering these 3 questions. So first, what is the topic? Second, what are the details? And third, what is the point? And when you're starting, you want to answer those questions as succinctly and as short as possible. Because when you're building your presentations, you want to start small and then start building it outwards, making it bigger. So you want to ask yourself those questions. And so here's kind of how I've worked through it for my experiences. And the two examples would be from my thesis and then also from this presentation. So with my thesis, what is the topic? Well, that was really hard for me to start organizing because my thesis from my master's was huge. It ended up being 250 pages because it had a lot of different pieces to it. And so when it was about and anytime it's about delivering a presentation that's about my thesis, I have a hard time narrowing down on that topic, right? So I always start with this really big generic topic of resilience and culture. So then I have to figure out, what are the details? And I want to be succinct. I want to be concise when I'm starting this organization process, right? So for the details for me is that basketball culture facilitates resilience for professional players and coaches. That was the specifics of the thesis. But then I want to be able to ask myself, what is the point? Why am I talking about the details of this topic? And my point, anytime I'm delivering a presentation about my thesis, is that there is a connection between culture and resilience. So that's my starting point. From there, I can start building in the specific points, the specific information, the specific statistics. I start building that in once I've got this organization, right? And then the other example is I really needed to use this for this presentation that I'm giving today, right? So my topic is public speaking. What are the details? Well, that was a little bit harder for me to kind of go over because I'm delivering 3 of these webinars. So I had to keep reminding myself the difference between the 3 webinars that I'm giving, whereas today is the basics of public speaking. Next week, I'll be talking about using presentations like slides and PowerPoints. And then the week after that is about nonverbal communication. So asking myself, what are the details, the basics of effective public speaking? That helped me start organizing my presentation and picking exactly what I'm going to talk about, right? But what is the point? I had to remind myself it's about understanding these 3 components. And that helped me from getting too carried away talking about, getting too into the weeds and too into the details about one specific topic. One of the things that I've been working on a lot lately is about building effective slides. And so when I first started making this presentation, I was kind of leaning on that because it's been in my mind a lot. But reminding myself that the point of this specific presentation is just to go over the basics helped me keep it organized in a manner that followed that flow that helps me make the point that I want to make. So that's why you want to ask yourself those 3 questions to start organizing, right? But we can't necessarily answer all these questions from the start, which is where this aspect of being knowledgeable comes in. So we want to be knowledgeable about our topic, right? We want to know the details. We want to know the point, but it's more than that. We also want to know what our point isn't. So that kind of goes back to my previous example of, well, my point in this presentation isn't to go into full detail about using PowerPoint slides. My point of this presentation is not to go into full detail about the effects of various nonverbal gestures. As much as I want to talk about those things, that's not my point. And so I need to know what my point is not so that I can be further comfortable with what my point is. This also really helps you if your presentation has a question and answering section at the end, because sometimes people will receive questions that are parallel to their topic, but aren't necessarily part of their topic, and they won't catch that, and they'll struggle to answer it because it's not entirely part of it. But if you know what your presentation is not about, you can say things like, that's an excellent question, but that's not necessarily the context of this presentation today. So if you'd like to speak further about it, we can set up a time later. But for today's presentation, I'm only talking about this. That really helps you stay organized. And it also helps you stay on topic in those moments in presentations where we forget what we're talking about and it starts to panic. So then you can just remind yourself, well, I'm talking about this and I'm not talking about this, right? So that's a really important part of being knowledgeable, is knowing the details of what your presentation is not about. But another issue with understanding what our point is that's very dependent upon who our audience is. We often tailor our main point based on who our audience is. So when I was delivering my thesis defense to my committee, my point was a little different than when I'm delivering just sections of that thesis to a different audience, right? So my committee, they wanted to know about the research methodology and the communication theory. But when I delivered a portion of my thesis at a conference about research in athletics, it was more about the athletic side of things than it was about the methodology side. So knowing about my audience, knowing what they're there for, knowing what they're looking for, knowing their interests, that really helped me understand what my point was. But it also helps understand or it helps you kind of figure out what anecdotes, what stories, what statistics, should you even use statistics? Should you use an emotional appeal? What kind of stories should you tell to prove your point or to support your argument? A lot of the answers to those questions is dependent upon who your audience is. So it's really important to know about your audience. Another thing to know about your presentation is some of the, I guess, the administrative side of things. So the timing of it, knowing how long your presentation is supposed to be is really important. And it's one of the things that causes us the most anxiety. It gave me anxiety when preparing for this, like, oh my God, I have to talk for an hour. Well, you don't have to, but knowing that time frame is really important. Knowing if you only have 3 minutes to deliver a presentation really changes the way that you organize. If you have an hour-long presentation, you can get into the details. If you have 3 minutes, you might not be able to dig into the details as much. So you may have to pick your most important key point and focus on that, depending on how much time you have. And then another thing to consider is the setting, right? So is it a Zoom presentation? Is it live? Is it in person? Is it a group presentation? Is it a like a symposium or a like a group presentation? Things like that. Those are pieces of information that you can use to help you organize your presentation in a more clear and effective way. And then the last thing to know is the presentation itself. And I'm really just talking about the structure and the organization of it. And this is mostly helpful when you're preparing your presentation and also when you're delivering it. Because one of the most distracting and terrifying moments is when you're talking and then you forget what you're talking about and you forget your place. And the panic just starts to set in, and then you're aware of how long it's been since you've said something and you, oh my God, so it just kind of downward spirals. But if you really are comfortable and knowledgeable about the structure and organization of your presentation, it can help you in those moments. So if you know that you're talking about the introduction, or if you know that you're in main point 2 and you know what the next point is, that really helps you just transition and move through your presentation in the moments when you get stuck, right? So when it comes to that initial starting point of kind of building and figuring out just the basics and organization of your presentation, the two things you want to focus on is the organization and the knowledge. So the organization, again, it's these 3 questions. What is the topic? What are the details? And what is the point? And you can kind of consider it in, I guess, that format of the way we're taught to write, where you have the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. In your introduction, you're delivering your topic. In the body, you're delivering the details. And in the conclusion, you're restating really your main point, because you should be saying your main point multiple times, but in the conclusion is when you really hammer that home. But we need to be knowledgeable about our presentation to effectively organize it. And it's not just about knowing the content, it's about knowing what isn't part of your presentation. It's about knowing what your point is not, but then there's also the basics of the speech itself that you need to know. Who is your audience? What is the timing, the setting, the structure, the organization, right? So those are very important pieces of that. Oh, I forgot I had made this slide where I was talking about both of them at the same time. And that's why I was going back and forth between these two, right? So that's one thing that you can know about your presentation is what slides you have and what tools you've given yourself, because that would have helped me present just knowing that I had this slide right here coming up next. So that's another thing that you want to be knowledgeable about is the technology situation. Right, so now we've kind of gone over being organized, being knowledgeable, and they kind of worked together, right? It's not doing one and then doing the other. It's kind of working on both at the same time. But we gave you that format on how to do it. Answer those 3 questions. What's the topic? What are the details? What's the point? And then those things to know about the presentation, the content, the setting, and the structure. But now let's talk about being engaging. So engaging is a couple of different things. You can have linguistic engagement or verbal engagement, and then you can have nonverbal engagement. And we'll talk about both of those. But what it means to be engaging is about being dynamic across the factors, right? Your goal is to be dynamic. You don't want to do too much of one thing. You don't want to do too little of another thing. And I'll explain these as we go. But basically, the thing that kills presentation engagement is being robotic. We want our presentations to be more of a conversation. We don't really want it to be scripted. We don't want it to be monotone. It's really, there are people that are just naturally monotone, but even those people still have fluctuations and variations in their tone, tempo, voice, pace. They still use gestures a little bit. But the nerves of delivering presentations can kind of make our body freeze a little bit. It can take away some of that dynamism, and we end up being really flat, slow, monotone. And those are the nonverbal things that allow us to kind of check out as audience members. And then the linguistic, the written, the content things that lead us to checking out and stop paying attention is if we're just flooded with basic information, just nonstop statistics and facts, we kind of check out. We need other things in there to balance it out. And so here are some of those other things that we can use to balance it out. Right, first we've got our topic information, but we also should use metaphors. We should have emotional elements, the human connection, right? I've been trying to do that with y'all, talking about how I get nervous, how I was pacing around my apartment for 20 minutes before the presentation started because I had so much energy and I needed to burn it off, right? That's that human connection. We learn better from humans than we do from robots. So if we have an emotional element, or if we tell a story, right? If your research is about sustainable practices, and you want to talk about how this specific bottle is better than our previous plastic bottles, and you bring in this story about plastic waste destroying an ecosystem, that's an emotional element, right? Those kinds of things, they added that engaging factor to our presentations. It's not just information. It gives us something else to kind of pay attention to and focus on. The other thing we can use is anecdote. I don't know if you know what an anecdote is. I say that because it took me like 15 years to finally remember what an anecdote is, but it's really just a story. It's a factual story that you can use to support your point. And that's something that I did at the very beginning. I told you about the professor at University of East London who was so nervous about a presentation, he thought about wrecking his car. That was an anecdote, right? It's just another piece of information that you can have that your audience can engage with. They hear this story and they connect it to the information. So that's what it means about being engaging. And then again, you can use statistics and facts. These always help, right? Being dynamic is about not doing too much of one, not doing too much of the other. So you don't want to have nothing but facts, but you should have some facts in there. You should have some statistics. As human beings, we like those things. It helps us connect with the material a little bit more. So we have statistics and facts so that they can connect with the content. We have metaphors, emotional elements, and anecdotes so that they can connect with the human being, with the human element of the presentation. And then lastly, we want them to be able to connect with the presentation itself. So we need to have transitions and internal summaries, right? So this right here was an example of an internal summary. I had spent about 10 to 15 minutes going over this stuff. And before I transitioned into engaging, I brought it back to remind you that we've gone over organized and acknowledgeable, and now we are transitioning into engaging. And the reason why you want to have these things is because it helps your audience pay attention to that bigger point, but also follow along as you're moving through. One of the fastest ways that I stop paying attention is where I lose track. What does this have to do with the key point? And then also, another way that I kind of stop paying attention is when there are no transitions, when it's just going from topic to topic to topic. And now I have to figure out what topic are we on? And I also have to figure out how does this topic connect to the main point? So now I have to do all this extra work as an audience member, which hurts my engagement. As a speaker, I want y'all to pay attention. So I want to present it to you in a way that you can. And so that's by having those human elements that you can connect to with stories, metaphors, anecdotes. It's got the factual elements that you can connect to with statistics, but it's got the transitions and the internal summaries that tie it all together and basically present it as a cohesive unit that the audience member can follow along and retain as they go. So that's why transitions and internal summaries are one of the most important pieces of an effective presentation. And one way that you can transition, it doesn't have to be a verbal statement. It can just be a pause. And it can also be a nonverbal gesture of like taking a drink. Your audience can take a second to gather themselves and get ready to move on. So that's what we'll do. So there is kind of a bridge, right? So I brought up that we've got linguistic engagement, metaphors, anecdotes, all that stuff, and we've got nonverbal engagement, which we'll get to in a second. But there's kind of a bridge in between these two, and that's our PowerPoints, our presentation aids, right? Because they're somewhat verbal, they've got words on them. They're somewhat nonverbal because they're not saying anything. So that's why they're that bridge. I'm gonna go through this relatively quickly because I'm delivering another webinar, I think next week, where I'll go more into detail about this. But the general rule for PowerPoint slides is keep them simple. The less content, the better. So a general rule, 5 by 5 for text, right? So on your slide, you really shouldn't have more than 5 lines of text, and you really should not have more than 5 words per line. Now, obviously, this isn't a hard rule that if you break it, your audience automatically stops paying attention, but it can help you guide and help you structure your presentation slides. And so the reason why you want to have less content is because if you put up a whole paragraph on your slide, your audience doesn't know whether or not they should listen to you or whether or not they should read it. And if it is something that you do want your audience members to actually read, you've got to build that into your presentation. You've got to account for how long it might take for them to read it. And you've got to tell them, I want you to read this. Because half of us, when we see something on a screen, we read it and stop paying attention. The other half doesn't read it and they keep paying attention. And then terrible statistics, a third half doesn't pay attention to either of them. They just completely shut out because there's just too much information in general. So that's why you want to keep it simple. You have to understand that your PowerPoint is not there to deliver the information. You are there to deliver the information. Your PowerPoint only helps. So that's why you have less content on there. Now, if you've got graphics instead of text, 4 graphics and 4 lines of text for those graphics. And I'll show you an example of what I mean by that. The other part is just keep them consistent, right? So when you open up PowerPoint, it'll give you those various themes you can pick for your whole slide. Just make sure that's the same. You don't ever want to be changing throughout because it just becomes distracting. So here, we'll go through some examples of bad ones. This is bad. This is way too much information. This is busy. There's a lot of different colors going on. Each block of that slide is filled with content. So the second I see this, I just stop paying attention. And this is close to one of the worst things I've ever seen. Another general rule that you can think of, if you are shrinking your font size to fit something, you've already got way too much content. If anything, you should just be making your font bigger, which was something that I learned delivering presentations. I gave a presentation to a class of working professionals who had all been teaching for like 30 years. So they were a little bit older than the presentations I gave the 3 months before that. They were all the college freshmen, and now I'm delivering to people in their 60s. And I didn't change my font size. And at the end, I asked for comments, and all of them said, your font is too small. You got to think about us, the audience, your font is too small. So if you're ever shrinking your font, you've made a mistake. But the other issue with this slide is that the graph is so busy. You don't know what story that graph tells. You don't know what you should be looking at. Should you be reading these thick blocks of text? Should you be trying to decipher the bar graph? And then while you're thinking about all this, you've stopped paying attention. And then further, what is the point of having such fine print down at the bottom? Almost like it's a terms of agreement checkbox. Like, why? There's no point in having that. So just always remember that when you're building your slides, less is better because you want the information to come from you. If you just make your audience read, they're not going to be engaged. We're not here to read, we're here to listen. So that's why you want less content. This one is a little bit better. So here's an example of having graphics. You've got each block here, but then it's also got text. And that's where I have some issue with this one, is even the text here, there's a little bit too much. So again, you want to keep it as simple as possible. Ideally, you would want this slide to just be the images, and then you as the speaker are delivering that content that would be here in those text. So again, General rules for building your slides: keep them simple. Follow that 5x5 rule as a guiding principle for keeping your content manageable on each slide. And then always remember, less is more. The point of a PowerPoint is just to help you, not to actually deliver that content. So now let's talk about nonverbal engagement a little bit. So we talked about organizing, we talked about being knowledgeable, we talked about linguistic engagement. That's our content, that's our transitions, our summaries, our metaphors, our anecdotes, and our statistics. We talked about the bridge in between the two, which is our our PowerPoint slides or whatever other presentation aids we might have. And then that last part of engaging, of being an engaging speaker, is the nonverbal element. That's our human factor. It's what separates us from Siri and from all the other robots. That's the key. But again, just like being dynamic with your linguistic content, your language, your material, you don't want to do too much, right? You don't want to have too many facts. You don't want to have too many emotional appeals. It's got to be the right balance. Well, it's the same for your nonverbal behavior, your nonverbal gestures. So we'll talk about each one. So there's a bunch of different kinds. There's facial expressions, there's eye contact, body movement, hand gestures, volume, tone, and tempo, and then fillers and paralinguistics. And so what paralinguistics are the noises we make, the ums, the ers, the things that aren't words. Quick disclaimer though, I get really frustrated when you see things on the news or like articles that say like body language expert has perfectly decoded the president and his wife's relationship by examining how they're holding hands. Nonverbal communication and nonverbal gestures don't really work like that. There is not a dictionary. There is not a set standard of like, you do this, it means this. You do this, it has this effect. Nonverbal communication is two things. It is highly contextual and it is highly cultural. So it's dependent upon the situation and it is dependent upon the people that you're speaking with. So keep that in mind, right? Remember, we want to be knowledgeable about our audience. So when we're trying to add in these nonverbal engagement factors, knowing our audience really helps. So again, being dynamic is about not doing too much of one, not doing too much of the other. So when it comes to your facial expressions, you just want to avoid being rigid. You want to avoid having that same expression the whole time. Let your face move, right? Let it do its normal thing. We've got a lot of muscles in the face and they're going to operate and you just got to let them happen. You also have to just kind of let go of your own insecurities, right? And so I'll give you an example. It's one of the first presentations that I remember giving in high school. It was in my health class. I don't remember what it was about, but my best friend is sitting in the back and the whole time that I'm giving my presentation, he's laughing. And so I go back there and when I'm done and I ask him what he's laughing about, he says, dude, your eyebrows just do this the whole time you're speaking. And so that was about 20 years ago at this point, maybe 15, somewhere. Anyways, for the last 15 years, every time I deliver a presentation now, I'm thinking about my eyebrows, right? And I'm wondering if I should try to keep them still. But I've realized over the years that trying to keep them still keeps my whole face still, which just makes me robotic. And it is also distracting. So try not to worry about some of these weird insecurities we have about our face, because we all have weird ones about our face. We have to do our best to ignore those things and let our face just do what it does, because that is what we expect when we have a conversation with a human, right? So if we're having a one-on-one conversation and their face never moves, we are going to notice that and we are going to get distracted and probably stop listening. Well, it's the same during a presentation. So just let it do its thing. Now, one thing that you do want to do is you want to have a slight smile. You'll see that at the bottom. That kind of helps the audience know that you care about what you're talking about. But of course, avoid the aggressive smiling. I feel like we've all been in that situation where maybe it was a salesperson or somebody delivering a presentation where they're just smile. How are you today? Oh, great. We're going to talk about cell phones and I'm going to tell you about our great plan. And you just, please stop smiling. This is too much, right? So when we do too much of something, it can be distracting, even if that kind of like controlled bit of it helps, right? A little bit of smiling helps. our audience feels more excited to be there if our presenter has a bit of a slight smile sometimes. Doesn't mean you're slightly smiling the whole time, just a little bit, right? It's your topic. You should be excited to talk about it. And if you can show that a little bit, your audience will receive that and they're more likely to pay attention and engage with your material. So the most important thing to do would be to allow the natural range of expressions to happen. And that's especially important when you're telling stories, especially those emotional appeals. If you are listening to a person talking about an infuriating story and they're smiling, that's weird. You kind of start paying attention to that and stop paying attention to the content. If they're talking about a happy story and they look angry, again, that's weird. So just let your face do its normal thing. And that's a really important process of building engagement in your presentations. So now we'll move on to eye contact. You'll see at the bottom, I like the scientific term for eye contact, oculesics. I put that in there for my statistics, for my facts, so I can be linguistically engaging. The things you want to avoid with eye contact is obviously doing too much of one thing. You don't want to look down. That's why we don't really we don't really tell people to have scripts, because then we'll read our script rather than making eye contact. That's why teleprompters are always right there at the camera, so it looks like you're still making that eye contact. It's also why you never want to have a presentation and look back at it, because now you're no longer addressing your audience. But the other thing that we kind of do subconsciously is we look more to our dominant side. So I'm right-handed, I'll naturally look over to the right side, which means I'm naturally neglecting my left side. So when we're delivering a presentation, we want to be deliberate about making eye contact across that whole spectrum of the audience, and it'll help us engage everybody. And then when it comes to our digital age, our socially distanced asynchronous age, giving a Zoom presentation, and this is one that I'm still struggling with a little bit myself, is where do we look on the screen? Sometimes I look into the camera. Sometimes I've got the participants, you're all on the right side of my screen, and I've noticed that I'm looking there the most, trying to bring it back to the camera. But I think the most important part is just make sure you have your camera in front of you. I've seen a couple of presentations where people have dual monitors, but their camera's on the monitor that's on the side, but they're looking at the Zoom that's in front of them, but the camera's over here. That's one of the worst things that you can do. I mean, imagine in a live setting, your audience is here and you're speaking this way. Your audience is not going to engage with you as a speaker. So when it comes to making eye contact, you just want to make sure that it's deliberate and that it's balanced, right? Not looking up, down, left, right too much, not looking to one side too much. Just be deliberate about it. Now, another reason why, or I guess a trick that is related to eye contact. So this is a trick that we teach to bring your anxiety down in the moment of a presentation, especially in a live setting, is make purposeful eye contact early. Find people in the audience and just make that eye contact with them on purpose so that you kind of get that out of the way. Because one of the most terrifying moments as a presentation is when you accidentally make eye contact with somebody in the audience and neither one of you were expecting it and you just kind of lock eyes. It's very distracting. So if you can make purposeful eye contact, that helps you take control of the situation, which will bring your anxiety down a little bit while also making you more engaging. So eye contact is really important. But another thing to think about is that cultural aspect, right? It is common, or not common, it is expected in Western, American, European culture that we make eye contact as a sign of respect. But in other cultures, making eye contact is not a sign of respect. So you need to know these kinds of things about your audience, right? It's also important when you are presenting. You might think that if your audience is not making eye contact, they're not paying attention. But again, that depends on the culture of the people that you're speaking to. So that goes back into that idea of knowing about your audience. So body movement, things you want to avoid would be closing yourself off. This is one of the most common gestures that we talk about as being closed off, is folding your arms. But there's other things that you can do that would close the self off, things like turning away. That's another reason why as a speaker, we don't want to ever look at the PowerPoint slides that are being projected, because now we're turning away. We're not even addressing our audience. Another thing you want to avoid doing is fidgeting. I'm a big fidgeter. I really love click pens, and I delivered a presentation one time just clicking up a storm and didn't even realize it. Did like 6 straight minutes of just clicking. So avoid those things. But there's other body fidgets as well, tapping your feet. I, for some reason, like to balance on one foot when I'm standing, and I'll sometimes do it in a presentation and start falling over like a tree. So pay attention to those kinds of things so you can take a little bit more control of it. The things to do, just keep your body open, avoid making fists, use your hands, you let your body just flow, just like letting your face do its normal range of expressions, let your body do its normal thing. And that will really help you, again, be a human being, which helps your audience engage with you rather than just listening to a robotic speaker. Hand gestures, same exact thing it's pretty much, yeah, it's the same thing as with your body, right? You want to avoid being rigid. You want to avoid fidgeting. You also want to avoid being inconsistent, right? So if you, a weird example, I've never seen this happen, but imagine somebody is counting out a list and they skip number 3, they go 1, 2, and they say 3, but they put up a 5. That's not consistent. That will make you, your audience will just get distracted by those kinds of things. So that's why you want to keep your gestures consistent. If you're going to be talking, if you're going to be using your hands to put up like distances, it was this far apart, make sure those are consistent. Don't say this is big and then this is moderate, right? So keep those consistent. And then most important is just, if you're a fidgeter, keep things out of your hands. If you're standing, you don't want your hands in your pockets, but you also don't want them behind your back the whole time. You don't want them folded in front the whole time. Let them move. But then when you are resting them, it's okay to have them just at your side. One of the more distracting things is when they're in your pocket the whole time. But again, it's about not doing too much or too little of anything. It's about having a nice balance. So volume, tone, and tempo, again, avoid the extremes and avoid being mono. So avoid being just the same tempo the entire time. Avoid being really slow the entire time. Avoid being really fast the entire time, those kinds of things. You want to be dynamic. Again, I brought it up. You can use pauses to make transitions. You can use volume to emphasize a point. We have to be organized. Get a little bit louder. That helps your audience know that was important. Those kinds of things. So when you're thinking about your volume, your tone, and tempo, think about these as a tool for you to emphasize certain points, to move through presentations, but you also really want to understand yourself, right? So another reason why I brought up that I used to be a basketball coach is because that's one of the things that it really informs me as a public speaker. That my first example speaking in public is yelling at 14-year-olds in a basketball gym. So when I transitioned away from basketball into teaching in the classroom, I was still a very loud person, and I was still a very high energy person. And I had to learn about that, and I had to learn how to control it and bring it down. And it's something I'm doing in this moment. I'm actively trying to keep a slower pace, and I'm trying to keep my volume down because I like teaching, and my energy comes up, and then I start getting loud and I start getting fast, and oh my God. But at the same time, don't worry too much about those things. It's about being natural and being human, especially when it comes to speaking too fast. We listen faster than we speak. So the fastest we can speak, I think, is about 120 words per minute, but we listen up to 400 words per minute. So even if you're speaking your absolute fastest, your audience can comprehend you. So don't worry about that, but worry about your speed just for your own physical sake. I used to have to stop and force myself to take deep breaths because I would be going so fast. But again, it's about being dynamic. Don't do too much. Don't be too loud, too fast, too slow. Balance it out. And then the last part is fillers and paralinguistics. The most common filler term is like. We all say like a lot. We all say and Just pay attention to those. If you do too many of them, they become distracting. But there's no point in trying to get rid of them altogether. It's part of how we speak. All cultures have filler terms and filler sounds. So don't worry about completely removing them, but pay attention if they're overwhelming. I had a teacher that said the word right And it was so distracting. I was also not the best student at the time, but it was very distracting to the point where in class, instead of taking notes, I was keeping track of how many times she would say the word right. And she was saying it like 12 times per minute, right? Like, it's just too much, right? Why would you write? There's no point in saying right that many times, right? Now, as a listener, all you can hear is the word right. So just pay attention to when you're doing it too much. And again, it's okay to have some of those. Now, you'll see at the very bottom of this slide, recording yourself is key for tending to these nonverbal aspects. You've probably heard that to prepare for a presentation, you should record yourself. These are the things that you want to look for when you're recording yourself. These nonverbal elements, right? You want to make sure you're dynamic so that you're not doing too much active facial expressions. You want to pay attention to your eye contact, your body movement, your gestures, and make sure that it's got a right balance where you're not doing too much or too little. And you want to practice a lot and record yourself so you can see what's comfortable for you and what is uncomfortable for you and find that perfect balance for yourself. So that's the basics. And now I'm actually gonna leave the PowerPoint and open up one of the forums that I put into the chat about practicing so we can go over practicing and preparing. But before we do that, just to remember, the basics of effective presentations is you want to be organized. So you want to know your topic, know your details, and know your point. You want to be knowledgeable, right? There's those aspects of our material that we need to know. There's the aspects of our audience and the setting that we need to know. And then there's the aspects of the speech itself that we need to know. And then being engaging is about having a balance between the content and our engagement tools like metaphors, anecdotes, and facts and transitions, and then engaging with our nonverbal aspects, our voice, our face, our gestures, those kinds of things. So now I'm going to go to the other handout so that we can talk about best tips for practicing. My gosh. Okay. Can y'all see the screen? This PDF? Okay, cool. So practicing for presentations. Let's see what time it is. Oh, we have 10 minutes. Practicing is key for knowing your timing. I practiced this twice, and one of the things I was most nervous about is if I was actually going to be able to speak for an hour. And now I'm freaking out because I only have 10 minutes left. So the number one thing when it comes to practicing your presentation, and I'm sorry for being aggressive and putting this in all caps, but you've got to practice speaking. It's the most important part. I have noticed for myself, and I've noticed for the people that I've taught public speaking, is that when we're preparing, we tend to just think about what we're going to say, and we don't actually practice saying it. And thinking about what we're going to say and actually saying it are two completely different mental processes. So if we want to be prepared to say the things that we're going to say in the moment, well, we have to get a lot of practice actually saying them. So here are some things that you can do to practice actually saying them. Number one is the 3-to-1 general rule. Practice your speech 3 times for every 1 minute that you will be speaking. Now, if you're delivering a short speech, 3-5 minutes, that's pretty easy. That's not a whole lot. But if you know you have a long presentation, that can be pretty daunting. So don't think of it as having to practice the entire presentation for that long. Think about it as breaking it up into sections. Practice your introduction 3 times. Practice your conclusion 3 times. Practice each main point 3 times. And if you've got 3 main points, that's 9 plus the other 6. You've already practiced your presentation 15 times. Again, it's about getting comfortable articulating the content, articulating the material. That's what you have to do. Now, another thing that you can do to prepare is quiz yourself. So break your presentation into those individual parts, right? So you've got your attention grabber, you've got your story that you're going to tell, or your fact or your anecdote. Then you've got your introduction. Then you've got your transition, your main point. So you've written that down on individual note cards. So you've got a whole slew of note cards. Each one of them on it has just one section. Pull out one at random. Okay, main point number 2. What's my main point number 2? Well, it's about being knowledgeable. What about being knowledgeable? We need to know these things. So if you can quiz yourself, that really helps you get comfortable with the material. And it also helps you have that conversational aspect about it, which brings me to my next point. Have conversations about your topic. That counts as practicing towards the 3-to-1 rule. One of my favorite ways to prepare for a presentation is to call up a friend and say, hey, I got a presentation coming up. Can I just talk to you about it? And then if your friend is, good at asking questions, they'll ask you questions that will help you organize the material and the presentation as you go as well. But one of the best ways to practice is to just have regular conversations about it, to get experience articulating the material with that specific purpose, that specific point. And then from there, you can start putting it into that presentation format. And then again, you want to record yourself. Pay attention to those nonverbal aspects we talked about. Pay attention to the timing of it so that you can be completely confident that you know you've got the timing down, you know each section, you know which gestures you're going to use at each point, you know where to pause, where to be loud, where to be quiet, where to slow down, all those kinds of things. So if you've broken your presentation down into 16 individual parts, pull one out, main point number 2, record yourself articulating main point number 2, and see where you can put in some of those gestures, see what worked, see what didn't. And now you have all these individual sections, and then it's a matter of putting it all together at the end. So you know you need to practice your presentation 21 times. And 15 of those times came from practicing the individual sections. All right, we'll just practice the whole thing a few more times, and you'll be good to go. And again, it's about actually saying it, not just thinking it. And then the last 2 here, number 6 and number 7, these are about preparing as you're coming up for the speech, preparing mentally to kind of bring your anxiety down and bring your confidence up. So the thing about anxiety is there's never going to be one thing that just gets rid of all of it. It's about chipping away at it, taking away some of these small things, right? So our anxiety with presentations, it often comes from this lack of control. We don't know if they're paying attention. We don't know what they're thinking. We don't know if they care, right? We don't know if we're going to mess up. That lack of control is anxiety producing. So take control of other aspects of your life. Wear something that you really like, that fits the environment, right? You know what kind of presentation it is. And if you need a tie, put on a tie. If it's less formal and you can wear short sleeves, then wear your favorite short sleeve shirt. Wear your favorite shoes. Take a little bit of control. Be deliberate about scheduling your day. Part of the reason I was so anxious about this presentation today is because I did a horrible job with my schedule, and it is just back to back to back to back meetings. And I didn't have my normal amount of preparation time that I normally do. And that really brought my anxiety up. So things like that. And then also pay attention to what you put into your body. I refuse to have coffee 2 hours before a presentation. It's just too much anxiety. So things like that help you take control of the day. They bring your confidence up, which will also bring your anxiety down. It's about doing little things to bring confidence up and anxiety down right before that last moment of the presentation, or right before it. And the most important part, again, it's in aggressive, all caps, self-talk. Pay attention to how you're speaking to yourself before you deliver a presentation. I always tell my students, speak to yourself as if you would speak to your 10-year-old self. One thing that I find really fascinating about the human experience is that we're typically more harsh to ourselves than we are to other people. So if our friend is getting ready to deliver a presentation, we would say, hey, you're going to do a good job. You got this. We went over it. We've had conversations. We've practiced. You're ready. But for some reason, when it's ourselves, it's a little more mean. It's a little more harsh. It's a little more bullying. Pay attention to that because it doesn't help you. So be supportive and be encouraging before and after you give your presentation. Both of those are important moments in which you can be supportive towards yourself, which brings confidence up and anxiety down. So just to quickly reiterate my tips for preparing for your presentation, practice speaking. The more times you can articulate the content and the material, the better, the easier it is going to be in that moment. The 3-to-1 general rule, try to practice your speech 3 times for every 1 minute you're speaking. Again, it's not a hard rule. You're not going to fail if you don't do it, but it really helps. Quiz yourself. Know the sections. Know what your main points are. Know what your transitions are. Know what your stats are. Know these things. Really helps. Have just normal conversations so that you can see what it feels like to be conversational about this material. Because if you can be conversational in the moment during the presentation, it's a bit more engaging. Record yourself specifically to pay attention to those nonverbal factors. And then take control, right? Control your day, control your schedule, control what you put into your body, all those kinds of things. And lastly, control your self-talk. You want to be kind. You want to be supportive, and you want to be encouraging. So that's everything.